A delay moves by 15 minutes, then 15 more. A crowded terminal wears you down until an overpriced escape starts to feel reasonable. A carry-on that looked fine suddenly becomes a target at the gate. And a flight that leaves late somehow still gets called on time. Most travelers see these as separate annoyances. They're not. They're part of a system that often protects the airline's schedule, money, and legal position before it protects your experience. And once you understand that, the airport starts looking very different. In this video, we're breaking down the quiet tactics airlines use to shape what you do, what you pay, and how much power you really have when something goes wrong. And the worst one is not the delay. It's the tactic that can leave you standing at the gate, ticket in hand, and still not let you board. Number 1. The delay is not just a delay. The most effective delay is not the one that strands you for 3 hours. It's the one that moves just enough to keep you from doing anything about it. 15 minutes, then another 15, then 20 more. Not enough to make the crowd panic, but enough to keep everyone locked in the same pattern, watching the screen, waiting for the next update, telling themselves it will probably move soon. And that is exactly the point. Because the moment an airline admits a delay is serious, passengers start changing their behavior. They look for rebooking options, they ask about refunds, they start checking what rights they may have. They stop being passive, and they start becoming expensive. But a delay that comes in small pieces creates a different kind of passenger. A quieter one, a more hopeful one. The kind of traveler who stays close to the gate, avoids making other plans, and keeps waiting because boarding still feels possible at any moment. The delay is not just buying the airline time. It is delaying your reaction. That is why you should never rely only on the announcement at the gate. If your flight keeps slipping in tiny increments, check where the aircraft actually is. Because if that plane is still sitting in another city, the small delay you were just given may not be a real update at all. It may simply be a way to keep the crowd calm while the real problem stays hidden. And once an airline learns how to delay your reaction, the next step becomes much easier, selling you relief. Number 2. They sell relief. Once the airport has worn you down, almost anything starts to feel worth paying for. That is what makes this next tactic so effective. The airline does not always have to force you into spending more. Sometimes it only has to leave you uncomfortable long enough for the wrong solution to start looking like a good one. A crowded terminal, nowhere to sit, too much noise, not enough space, and no clear idea when your flight is actually leaving. That combination drains people fast, and once it does, the promise of peace, quiet, food, a charger, or simply a better chair can feel less like a luxury and more like an escape hatch. That is where expensive lounge access starts to work on people. On paper, it sounds reasonable. You pay once, step away from the chaos, and make the delay easier to survive. But in reality, that escape is often overpriced, overcrowded, and disappointing. By the time many travelers realize that, the money is already gone, and that is the trap. The airport creates the discomfort first, then the industry sells relief back to you at a premium. That does not mean lounges are always a bad idea. It means tired travelers make expensive decisions faster. So before paying for comfort in the middle of a frustrating delay, slow down and check what you are really buying. Because once stress takes over, convenience starts feeling more valuable than it actually is. And that pattern matters. Because the more tired, distracted, and worn down you become, the easier it is for the airline to shape what happens next, including how early you show up, where you wait, and how closely your carry-on gets noticed. Number 3. When being responsible starts working against you. Most travelers think arriving at the gate extra early is the smart thing to do, and sometimes it is, but it can also make you easier to process, because the earlier you settle in right in front of the gate, the more time airline staff have to notice you, study your carry-on, and decide whether your bag looks like a problem before boarding even begins. What feels responsible from your side can look convenient from theirs. You are visible, predictable, and already in position. And that matters more than many travelers realize, because once a bag gets flagged early, the airline has already moved the situation in its favor. The suitcase can be pulled out of the line before the rush of boarding starts. The fee can be charged sooner. The decision gets made before the pressure of a crowded jet bridge, and a full cabin makes everything messier. In some cases, there is even extra incentive behind that scrutiny, with certain low-cost carriers rewarding gate agents for catching oversized bags and forcing them to be checked. So this is not just about whether your carry-on technically fits. It is about timing, visibility, and leverage. The longer you sit there, directly in front of the gate, the more opportunity there is for your bag to become part of someone else's efficiency strategy. Because from the airline's point of view, handling your bag early helps clear the boarding process, protect the schedule, and reduce last-minute friction. That does not mean you should arrive late or cut it close. It means there is a difference between being prepared and making yourself easy to pre-process. And once you notice that, another airline trick starts making more sense too: why a late flight can still be sold to you as an on-time success. Number 4. When on time doesn't mean what you think. Most passengers assume a simple thing if a flight lands on time. The airline handled the situation well. But that is not always true. Because sometimes the airline does not solve the delay. It simply builds enough extra time into the schedule to hide it. That is why a flight can leave the gate late, sit on the tarmac longer than expected, and still arrive on time in the official record. Not because the airline pulled off some miracle in the air, but because the schedule was padded from the beginning. A trip that should take 2 hours may be listed as 2.5. That extra cushion protects the airline's performance numbers and makes the experience look better on paper than it felt in real life. And that is where the frustration comes from, because from the passenger's point of view, the delay was real. You still waited. You still lost time. You still sat there wondering why nothing was moving. But on paper, the story becomes much cleaner. The airline gets to point to an on-time arrival, even if the trip itself felt delayed from beginning to end. That is why you will sometimes hear a pilot say the crew made up time in the air. Sometimes they did. But sometimes the only thing being made up is the gap between your experience and the version of the trip the schedule was designed to protect. And once you see that pattern, the last tactic becomes much easier to understand. Because if the airline has already found ways to manage your reaction, your money, your timing, and even the story told by the schedule, the next thing it wants to protect is its power. Number 5. The rules stay vague for a reason. This is where the game changes. Up to this point, the tactics have mostly been about controlling how you wait, what you spend, and how you move through the airport. But the final tactic is bigger than that, because it deals with the one thing every passenger thinks they already have once they hold a ticket the right to board. And in reality, that right is not as secure as most people think. The reason is simple. The moment you buy a ticket, you also agree to something most travelers never read: the airline's contract of carriage. That document gives the airline broad discretion in situations where it decides a passenger is unfit, disruptive, improperly dressed, or otherwise not suitable to fly. And when a flight is oversold, that vague language becomes especially important. Airlines routinely sell more tickets than there are seats, hoping some passengers will not show up. But when everyone does show up, somebody has to lose. And if the airline has to involuntarily deny boarding in the clearest sense, compensation may be required. That creates a financial problem for the airline. Vague rules can help create a different kind of solution. That is why this part matters so much. Because once the situation turns tense, the issue is no longer just the seat. It becomes the story attached to you. Are you calm, or are you becoming difficult? Are you dressed appropriately, or can someone argue that you are not? Are you frustrated but composed, or are you giving the airline language it can use against you? And that is what makes this tactic so dangerous. The rules do not always need to be broken to work against you. They only need to be flexible enough to be interpreted in the airline's favor when the airline needs leverage most. So if something goes wrong at the gate, the worst move is often the most understandable one losing control. Because the moment you become the easiest problem to document, you also become the easiest passenger to remove from the equation. That does not mean airline staff are always acting in bad faith. Often they are enforcing policies they did not write. But from the passenger's perspective, the lesson is still the same. Know that the language is broader than it looks, and never assume your ticket alone guarantees the outcome. Because by the time most travelers realize how much discretion the airline has, the final decision has already been made. That is the pattern most people never see. The delay is not always just about time. Sometimes it is about delaying your reaction. The discomfort is not always accidental. Sometimes it sets up the next sale. Showing up early does not always protect you. Sometimes it makes you easier to process. On time does not always describe your experience. Sometimes it protects the numbers, and when everything else fails. The broadest rules are often the ones that give the airline the most power. This is not about becoming paranoid every time you fly. It is about seeing the system clearly enough that you stop moving through it blindly. Because once you understand what the airline is really protecting, you become much harder to confuse, much harder to pressure, and much harder to manage.